Welcome everyone this beautiful rainy morning. My name is Sunday Steinkrishner. I'm the owner of B&B Rare Books, which is a rare book gallery right here in Manhattan. I'm also the vice chair of the ABA's Mid-Atlantic chapter and the chair of the New York International Antiquarian Book Fair. I'd like to welcome you all to NYIABF Presents, and I'm happy to introduce Allie Alvis. Allie Alvis is a book historian and educator, communicating the material, book culture of books as book historia on various social media platforms. They are a rare book cataloger, a Washington, D.C. book dealer type punch matrix, and the former Special Collections reference librarian of the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. Allie holds a master's degree from the University of Edinburgh in the history of the book and a second master's from the University of Glasgow in information management and digital preservation. They have published and spoken on a wide variety of topics, including the use of arsenic in book bindings, the history of bookshelf organization, and the conservation of the Douglas cockerel and son. Allie?
I've got you. All right, yeah, thank you. Let me echo Sunday's thanks for coming out on this horrible rainy day. I brought a friend who managed to not get wet, so I will talk about that more later. Let's get this show on the road. And click. Awesome, let's go. Thank you. Okay. I love books. I haven't read a single fiction book cover to cover in 2 years. And the last one I did read was on a Kindle. These are not contradictory sentences. There are many different ways to love books, just as there are many different shades of love among people. But in the same way that romantic love is often held up as the pinnacle of human emotion, equating loving books with loving to read books misses swathes of nuance. My personal brand of love for books revolves around their physical forms and what they can tell us about their history and the people who made them. And while your first thought here may be of signed bindings or warm calligraphic gift inscriptions, the aspect of books I love most is evidence of, well, love. Old books reach out to us through the centuries as containers of human emotion, not just in their texts, but in their physical form. Sure, sometimes that means they're clothed in fine bindings that speak to their status as treasured objects. But more frequently, that means something else altogether. This talk will celebrate the many different ways that books show they've been used and loved through the centuries, examining how human interaction can change their very forms. There was a popular post format on social media recently that compared a woman's 40-year-old slept with, hugged, cuddled, loved Garfield plush with a like-new version of the same plush. Side-by-side images of the two appeared on Twitter, captioned, "To be loved is to be changed." You can't deny that for all its misshapenness and soil, the loved Garfield has a look of quiet contentment that the that the like-new Garfield does not. This is in large part due to the fact that Garf's eyeballs have rubbed off of the loved plush, and in our sentimental, cartoon, familiar human brains, we read the resulting pattern as, "Oh, his eyes are closed, sweet happy boy." The "to be loved is to be changed" format was quickly adapted for posts of before and after photos of adopted cats, from looking frightened and or bedraggled to looking alert and happy in their loving homes. From here, it spread into a variety of fandoms and simultaneously made the leap into ironic, weird, and referential. But today, I would like to apply it to books. Whether that means they're written in, kissed, conserved, or read beyond all recognition, in the act of loving books, we change them. Many an author has spilled ink on these changes in terms of their significance to our understanding of history, but today I will be focusing on well-loved books not just as historical objects, but as icons that communicate human experience across time. Books, unlike many other artifacts that come down to us through the ages, are meant to be worked with in the same way as when they were new. Centuries later, books meant to be handheld references still fit perfectly in your palm. Handwritten or printed words still cause synapses to fire in understanding. You can't walk into the Museum of London and try on Queen Victoria's bustle dress, but you can turn the pages in her books exactly as she did. And it is this consistency of use, I believe, that makes books more valuable than almost any other media in making deeply personal historical connections. Through literally putting ourselves in the place of readers of the past, we can more closely identify with them. By acknowledging the significance of books as emotional conduits, we foster a more fruitful method of engaging with them, whether that means with the text or with the book as an object, or any sort of mixture of the two. More than other objects, a book is felt to embody not only physical memory, but also a record of past thoughts, notes Brian Cummings. With only the simplest of mental gymnastics, you can imagine a book to be an incredible magic object that somehow manages to transmit thoughts via ink on a page. And I think it's this magic that draws many of us to books when we're learning how to read. Philomena Kunk here is playing this concept for laughs, but she really gets at the interaction between physical and metaphysical that happens when you handle an old book and absorb the information it contains, whether that's through reading the main text or reading the paratexts. This is particularly relevant in the realm of rare books, however you define that term. David McKittrick observes that the history of book collecting and the appreciation of books is the history of objects whose physical properties are an integral part of how they are valued at particular times, and the reasons why they were sought out. When Lizzie Young reached out to me to give this talk, she highlighted my bite-sized book history YouTube video on yucky books, as I frequently call them. This is one of many episodes of the Bite-Sized Book History series, but it in particular seems to resonate with people. And writing it took maybe a third of the time that it usually takes for me to write an episode, because there's so much emotion wrapped up in well-loved books. They wear their history on their sleeves, putting us in close proximity with their former owners through the way they now look and feel. Old books hold both author and reader. As Milton said, books contain a potency of life in them because they preserve, as in a vial, the purest efficacy and extraction of that living intelligence that bred them. Jessica Pressman, too, observes the vivacity of books, noting that we learn to see ourselves in books and to understand ourselves through interactions with them. We are interpolated into becoming selves and subjects through books. The humanity of old books is something that appeals not just at antiquarian book fairs or special collections reading rooms, but online. On Instagram, the hashtag bookcollector contains far more posts than the hashtag bookcollection, demonstrating not only interest in the human element of collecting, but in the desire to be personally identified with books. This concept can also be witnessed in the phenomenon of the shelfie, a portmanteau of selfie and bookshelf, and the phenomenon of the Zoom bookshelf, which rose to prominence during the days of the COVID lockdown. Books are frequently a metonym for the self, and one that people actively cultivate to make a point of sharing. This is an example of what Jessica Pressman describes as bookishness in her 2020 monograph of the same name. Bookishness is about constructing and projecting identity through the possession and presentation of books. And it's not new. Take a stroll through any art gallery and observe the numerous painted portraits purposely staged in libraries, in which the sitter places their hand on a stack of books in order to visually communicate that they are learned and have the means to be so. But these portraits do not only contain uniform leather spines and attractively bound books. Often, there are books sitting around in wrappers or in relatively inexpensive limp parchment bindings. Nicholas Pickwoad has identified these portraits as saying something very specifically bookish. I care not for the aesthetic of my library, but value it solely for the contents. The accuracy of this implication, however, is thrown into question when we explore the surviving collections of some of these portrait subjects. In practice, there are not many books in wrappers and plenty in fancy leather. Is this love? In a way. It's a form of self-love, an example of the importance of projecting a certain identity in order to progress in the world. It is a relative of the kind of love practiced by 19th and early 20th century book collectors, more concerned with the outward appearance of their books than in their structural integrity. Their use of subpar materials, chiefly leather pared within an inch of its life, has led to many a cracked joint when anybody wants to, read the book. Some have called this type of book library furniture, but I think Mark Heim of Biblioctopus captures it best, glowing with all the glossy dumbness of a dead fish. A dead fish retains some of its fishness even in death, but it will never again do fishy things like swim through the water or eat tasty worms. Books bound to be looked at certainly retain some of their bookness, but their unsuitable bindings prevent them from doing booky things like being read. We can see already that even this passive love of books has had physical effect on their forms. William H. Sherman, quoting Anne Fadiman, suggests that people who value books fall into two categories. Those she calls courtly lovers read a book with platonic adoration, a noble but doomed attempt to conserve forever a state of perfect chastity. For those she calls carnal lovers, on the other hand, a book's words are holy, but the paper, cloth, cardboard, glue, thread, and ink that contain them are a mere vessel, and hard use is a sign not of disrespect, but of intimacy. Thomas Frognall Dibdin's classic bibliomania identifies a passion for unique copies as the fourth symptom of the terminal book disease. Fadiman's carnal lovers sent many of these unique copies down to us through the centuries, enough to populate the floor of 1,000 armories. So what does this kind of love look like? There's almost infinite variation here. There are additions, removals, and repairs made both on purpose and accidentally, and when you come across one, you'll likely find others. It's an inherently queer framework. So much of bibliography is about finding difference, celebrating and highlighting textual diversity, and analyzing divergent practices, muses Dylan Lewis in his piece on queer bibliography. Rare book professionals and book lovers alike look for instances of non-normative practices or presentation of moments. It is a methodology of finding queerness. It's the illumination that has become blurred from repeated kissing. It's the notes added in the margins. It's the tactile quality of a leaf that has been turned frequently. This queer love is at the heart of how we study material culture and how we relate to books. Love takes a physical form in books. Let's start at the binding and work our way out to see what this means. The binding itself is a form of love, applied to protect the precious pages within. The state of the binding is frequently the first clue that a book has lived an eventful life. Even before you pull them off the shelves, you can sometimes see what parts of a book were most favored by past owners. Just look for the telltale creases in the spine. Or the spine covering may be absent altogether, perished after too frequent flexing. This loss of covering can extend to the boards as well, edges made bare by unconscious rubbing or absent-mindedly picking at a rough spot. Once creamy alum-tawed pigskin turns gray or brown after being held in centuries of unwashed hands. Fancy textiles become threadbare. Once sharp corners become rounded. This damage can reveal information otherwise hidden in more perfect examples. Look no further than Patrick Olson's discovery of a potentially pre-Gutenberg example of Western printing, hidden away as spine lining, for evidence of why such damage can be valuable. Some binding damage is less valuable, but equally fascinating. Even the thickest of boards can fall victim to a breach from hungry invertebrates or rodents, telling us about how books were stored in the past and how frequently they were or weren't used. A striking example is this manuscript at the Library of Congress, which, while apparently neglected by a human owner for a period, was absolutely loved by a rat. Humans, of course, are also known for devouring their books, usually in a more figurative sense. But book lovers of the past were well aware of the marks and damage that use could leave. There are plenty of examples of ad hoc book covers that survive, such as this leather and parchment dust jacket that adorns a dictionary that was sold from the Type Punch Matrix booth. This was going to be a plug for this, but yeah, it already sold, so yeah. It is clearly not made by a binder, but by someone of passable skill with a needle and thread and access to scraps. This one is removable, but particularly on old school books. There we go. You find cloth covers sewn over bindings. Now, it is arguable whether or not the children using these school books truly loved them. I was ambivalent at best to the vast majority of my school textbooks. But these protections are evidence of parental love. Who would want their child to have a work out of a torn-up book? I mentioned subpar but pretty fine bindings earlier, but there are plenty of other beautiful bindings that actually do their job. The desire to make a book beautiful is evident even in the earliest surviving Western-bound codex, the 7th century St. Cuthbert's Gospel. This ornamentation serves no structural purpose. An argument could be made that it allowed for a less slippery grip on the book when holding it in the hand, but if utility were its only purpose, it would look much different. The Lindau Gospels of the Morgan Library date to within 2 centuries of the St. Cuthbert's Gospels, and while the level of embellishment on its treasure binding is dizzying in comparison, it also enables good reading practice. Its craftsmen strategically placed gem settings that stand a bit proud of the board to act as bosses, keeping it slightly elevated above whatever surface it's resting on. Of course, the key reason the Lindau Gospels is so bejeweled is to venerate the holy text within, and to show off the wealth of the court of one of the grandsons of Charlemagne. Very little has changed in this department over the centuries, with Sangorski and Sutcliffe and other binders picking up the treasure binding banner in the early 20th century for wealthy book owners seeking to honor their favorite texts while making a splash. Now to move beyond the binding. Wear and marks on the insides of books reveal not only that a book was loved, but what parts specifically were loved and what parts weren't. These marks are both active and passive, purposeful and accidental, serious and less so. Most well-studied, perhaps, is marginalia, which generally record the thoughts of readers in the form of words or symbols. In a survey of the Huntington Library's early printed books, William H. Sherman observed that something like 1 in 5 contained notes from early readers. Reading has historically been as much a province of the hand as of the eye, with students taught to record their thoughts in the margins as they went. Frequently, they are reflections on the text, such as most of the notes in this 1491 copy of Pliny's Natural History held by the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives, once part of the library of the monastery of Santo Stefano in Italy. Thanks to the fact it was housed in a monastic library, it bears the marks of many different monks, sometimes to comedic effect. Among the expected notes cross-referencing other historical texts or expanding on the points Pliny makes are monks arguing with each other in the margins, and even correcting each other or typos in the text. One monk in particular used the book as a place to store random thoughts and observations, such as a reminiscence of a time when a holy icon passed through town, or how the local baths had a reputation for curing stomach ailments. It also contains a smattering of manicules, those little pointing hands you sometimes see flagging important passages. While the manicules in this Pliny are fairly run-of-the-mill, they can be amazingly detailed, incorporating fashionable sleeves and arms. Their anthropomorphic form draws the eye. We come to know the world using our hands, so it is only fitting that representations of them are used to make special note of important passages. Manicules can be tentacular, or they can take on the forms of birds, or even genitalia. But they don't have to. Sure, the bigger the manicule, the more attention is drawn to it, but drawing amusing pointy creatures or lacy cuffs doesn't serve any particular purpose other than to bring joy, whether that's during the process of drawing them or after, when later readers come across them. The cousin of the unnecessarily detailed manicule is the doodle. From time immemorial, people, especially children, have allowed their minds to wander in books, filling blank spaces with all sorts of fanciful things. Doodles are kind of the black sheep of marginalia. They generally don't record explicit reactions to the text, so literary scholars of the past have largely ignored them. And the vast majority of them are done by amateurs, so art historians of the past have turned up their noses. However, unlike almost anything else we've looked at so far, doodles are perhaps not evidence of love for the book itself, but evidence of wider human emotion and delight. School books, again historically not the most beloved by their owners, are chock full of doodles, from the abstract to the quite detailed. After all, if you're bored in class, what better way is there to amuse yourself than letting your imagination wander? This book in particular, an 1819 manual of arithmetic, reveals a lot about one of its early owners. Among the efforts at solving the problems set out on the pages are numerous drawings of soldiers, including 2 toting American flags. These drawings likely sprung from the mind of a young boy named James, whose ownership inscription is faintly visible on the front face down. You could very easily imagine little James doodling Fortnite characters in his notebooks in 2023. Of course, many children didn't have quite such a clear grasp on the human form. Even James toyed with the more experimental style in 1 or 2 of his doodles. The funny little triangular folks in this arithmetic book from 1894 are almost cubist, and these strange characters bear a striking resemblance to Arthur from The Tick. Early modern readers were also quite the little artists, and in a time before standardized education, their canvases were most often Christian religious books. The doodles contained in the University of Glasgow Library's MS Hunter 232, a 15th century manuscript of John Lydgate's Life of Our Lady, wouldn't be out of place among the weird little guys that populate more modern books. Of course, people don't have to take a pen or a pencil to a book to leave their mark. A smeared illumination is an evocative example of human love changing a book. Smears like this are usually not from careless handling, but from kissing. In the medieval Christian tradition, illuminated manuscripts were understood to be a tool of direct intercession with the divine. By repeatedly kissing illuminations, readers mimicked showing reverence to a physical holy figure. Even unconsciously, people leave evidence behind through the act of reading itself. Finger soil is a term you might come across in a bookseller's catalog, and it is what it sounds like: marks left by dirty or greasy fingers, or toning from frequent page turning. Depending on the darkness of the marks, it's pretty obvious what parts of the book were read and what parts weren't. There is also the texture of the paper. We often compare rag paper to the texture of a dollar bill, since not only is the fiber content similar, they wear in the same way. Imagine a new crispy one, and then imagine a dollar that has been passed around Manhattan bodegas for a few years. The ghostly fingers of readers of the past can tell us a great deal about their habits, even if they didn't leave a name or marginalia behind to identify them. Books act as containers of love, not just for bookish love, but love of other things. Plenty of examples of books exist that contain dirty paw prints of cats or dogs. There's even one out there containing footprints of a chicken. One can imagine the book owner was not thrilled that their animal marched across their open pages, just as your cat stomping across your keyboard while you're writing an email is not ideal. But there is love in their presence. They call to mind a beloved furry companion cozying up to their owner while the owner reads. Pressed flowers are another kind of love once removed, a memory of a beautiful spring day or a gift from someone special. This is to say nothing of the christening cards, marriage invitations, funeral programs, and other evidence of important life events frequently found tucked into family Bibles for safekeeping. This is a particularly interesting example of that concept. A regional directory, a kind of predecessor to a phone book, literally turned into a scrapbook by an owner pasting clippings and illustrations directly over the book's text. The binding was not meant to hold all this extra paper, so the owner was forced to take matters into their own hands, reattaching the boards in a positively Frankensteinian manner. Up until now, I've spoken about things added to books, but over the centuries, plenty of things have been removed from books as well, whether nominally or actually out of love. Early bindings have been removed from books due to the kind of wear I was singing the praises of earlier, or simply because they were deemed unsuitable for the kind of text they contained. Marginalia especially has suffered quite severely from past book collectors' love of clean copies, no matter what the cost. Bleached or trimmed margins are the bane of the book historian. And this removal was not only because collectors wished to imagine what a book looked like new, but due to various anxieties about marginalia. As marginal note-taking became replaced by note-taking in notebooks, seeing scribbles of the past clashed with the modern etiquette of book use. Virginia Woolf described marked-up books as an almost sexual violation of both the text and its future readers. The people who excised cluttered, defaced margins believed not that they were taking something away, but that they were somehow restoring a piece of the book's dignity, or that their actions simply had no consequence. Again, sometimes the love on show in books is not for the books themselves, but for something else. For example, the precious stones pried out of this Armenian gospel book from the 13th century, housed in the Beinecke Library. Whoever removed them clearly didn't care much about the manuscript, but loved the idea of making some money. In a more abstract way, the love of readers is still actively causing absences today. Many titles have simply been cherished to destruction, with no trace of them remaining, and the well-loved examples that do survive offer challenges to digitization efforts owing to their fragility. Not only that, editors have been known to crop out damaged edges in photographs of books for publication. Sympathetic conservation can help fill in the gaps of things removed from books out of love, both physically, through repairing structures to make a book able to be handled again, and digitally. This strengthening can allow books to be digitized without damage. Of course, as with many of my examples today, overenthusiasm can lead to some borderline comedic results. Those corners stick out like a sore thumb in this illuminated manuscript. But what is conservation if not love? Conservation buys us more time to spend with treasured books, and if performed ethically, even allows itself to be undone if so needed. But unconserved, gnarly, lumpy, bumpy books are what speak to me personally. Some books are so loved and so intensely loved for so long that they completely change shape. You've probably been wondering what this thing on the table is. This is a 1605 English Breeches Bible, so called because of a translation of the clothing Adam dons when he and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. You can see an example of it side by side with a conserved copy that was recently auctioned in Ireland. I think it fetched something like £20,000. Likely mostly due to provenance and not so much the book, but that's a different story. You can compare its frankly bizarre geometry with the conserved copy. Frost Rare Books, who I bought this book from late last year, described it as simultaneously trying to eat itself and spit itself out, and being held together by nails, string, and fear. While it does kind of look like a horror show, it almost screams, "Look how much people loved me." Its most noticeable trait, its concave spine and convex foredge, comes from lying wide open on generations of tables and laps, and the nails and string were applied to help it continue to be actively used without disintegrating. And they've largely been successful. I haven't quite collated it, but it only seems to be missing 3 or 4 leaves, which is frankly miraculous when you look at the state of the thing. This beauty contains 3 different owner names, although there were certainly others in the 418 years since its publication. The initials NR adorn the cover, referring to possibly the first owner, Naomi Richmond. Not only did she write her name inside, she made a point to underline a passage in the book of Ruth about her Old Testament counterpart. The book contains plenty of underlining, as well as a couple examples of abstract doodles, but unfortunately little in the way of marginalia. It also contains fingernails. And unfortunately, this is not the first time I've found fingernails in the gutter of an old Bible. This French Bible from 1712 also contains fingernails, and enough gutter dirt and hair and plant matter to make even the hardiest of yucky book lovers queasy. There are many similarities between these 2 books, including their broken spines and the texture of their leaves. So thin from centuries of turning that you can barely even feel them anymore. But despite their outward appearances, they are very sweet smelling, perhaps from fragrant church incense. The big difference between these 2 books are the contemporary metal bosses of the 1605 Bible and the incredibly gaudy cross on the 1712 Bible. Is this a precious piece made of solid gold and gems? A treasure binding? Absolutely not. This is a cross from the early to mid 20th century and features gems made of plastic and glass. And it is 100% of the reason why I bought this book. While I don't know when the 1605 Bible left the possession of Naomi Richmond's descendants, the campy bauble glued to the 1712 Bible told me a story. That of someone who wanted to glorify a precious family heirloom in the style of a real treasure binding they had perhaps seen in a museum or church. They weren't concerned with adding or subtracting monetary value. They simply wanted to amplify its sentimental and/or sacred value. This is love. To be loved is to be changed. In a reflection on the recent rise of AI image generation and ChatGPT writing, Oliver Darkshire of Southerns remarked, "If I press a button and create down to the particles an exact copy of a first edition, a collector will nevertheless spurn it in favor of the real thing, because we are creatures of sentiment. We like best things that authentically relate us and bring us closer to other humans." Well-worn books contain 1,000 little mysteries put there by centuries of sentiment, sometimes the sediment of sentiment as well. As much as we love to personify them, books are inanimate. It is people that give them context and color. On social media, I am sometimes asked if my books are haunted. I generally don't reply to those comments, but honestly, they kind of are. Books can't love you back, no matter how much emotion and how many resources you may pour into them. But after years of being filled with humanity, they do, in a way, hold something of the spirit of their past owners. They are no longer perfect, sharp-cornered rectangles of processed organic materials. They are rounded manifestations of love that flop open to the perfect page when held in your hand or on your lap. And that, I think, is beautiful. Thank you. Annie, quit scribbling in your books. That is from one of the many horrible, awful school books from the 19th century that I have at home that I buy specifically for stuff like this. I periodically go on eBay and just search antique book, like when I'm bored, and I just scroll through the results that come up. And sometimes you find like really amazing stuff like this for like $10. It's really amazing if you have the patience and the sort of experience to understand that the book that is coming is not going to look great. But I am happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Just raise your hand and I will point at you. Or comments, or I can also just show this off to the best of my abilities. I know it's been sitting on its little pillow here, but you can see how much this book block is removing itself from the book and the corresponding V shape of the spine. And this is the string that is holding it together. It also, I'm not sure what the significance of the nails in the joint are, but they're there. And I'll try to open this in a way that it won't completely fall apart, but it's loved. Someone has absolutely adored this book for centuries, many different someones. And it's just, I don't know, it's one of my favorite books in my collection, and I never stop thinking about it. It's just such a beautiful, evocative example of the favorite things that I have in books. So, question?
I love the accession library.
Yes!
The ones that have like the old print on them.
Yeah, I know, it's fascinating. It like captures that idea of a book that used to be able to be checked out, and people could take it home and read it over coffee or candles or whatever, and sometimes you find both coffee and candle wax in them. But yeah, it has that history in it. And that's one of my favorite things about books, is that you don't have to read them to read them. That you can look at that and say, wow, things have happened here. And you don't necessarily know what things unless you get a little closer to it. But it's just the sense that, you look at this podium and it looks like a podium. This is nothing. And you don't get a sense of how many people have stood up here and given talks at the Armory. But you look at that and there are people there are hands, there is action. And I think that is just very, very evocative. So if nobody else has any questions, thank you again for coming today. I think there might be still food and possibly mimosas out there. I thought I heard champagne, so go forth and mimose.